You have almost certainly seen this one already. The Roman statue, the block text, the claim that every empire dies at 250 years, and America turns 250 this year. It has been on your feed. It has been in your comments. And if you have had your fill of people telling you that the end is scheduled, honestly, I do not blame you for clicking away right now, but there is a sentence buried in the original 1976 essay that nobody who shares that screenshot has ever read. It was written by the man who invented the 250-year clock, and in it he admits that the dates he used were largely arbitrary. He says it plainly, in his own pamphlet, and then everyone quoting him skipped the paragraph. So the countdown is a fake. That part is easy. What is not easy, what took me an unreasonably long time to sit with, is that when you strip the fake clock away, something is still standing underneath it, something a Tunisian judge described 600 years earlier, and a Soviet-born scientist predicted with equations in the pages of Nature 10 years before it happened. Get comfortable and subscribe or join if you have not, because there is a full library of these deep dives over on Patreon, going wider into collapse, physics, history, and everything adjacent. Stay to the end, because by the time we get to the bottom of this, you will understand why the ability to see the fall coming might be the clearest symptom that you are already inside it. Let's start where it started. Sometime around the year 930, a man in the city of Baghdad sat down to complain about the state of the world, and what he wrote down has survived for 1100 years. And when a British general read it in the 1970s, he told his friends he could scarcely believe his eyes. He thought, at first, that it had to be a joke, because the man in Baghdad was describing celebrity singers. He was describing the way the young people had stopped caring about the old virtues and had started worshipping entertainers instead. Performers with stringed instruments who drew crowds the way a general once drew crowds. He was describing a wealthy, anxious, comfortable population that had begun demanding a shorter working week. He was describing women moving into professions that had always been closed to them. He was describing a mania for food, for luxury, for status, for distraction. He was describing an obsession with the private lives of the famous. And he was describing all of it in the tone of a man who could feel something ending underneath his feet, even though the empire he lived in was still, by every visible measure, the richest and most sophisticated civilization on the face of the earth. The general who read that description was named John Bagot Glubb, and the reason it stopped him cold was that it did not read like ancient history. It read like a newspaper he could have bought that morning in London. Same complaints, same symptoms, same strange, decadent, distracted mood, arriving in a society that still thought of itself as the centre of the world. And Glubb had spent his whole life watching an empire, so he knew what that mood meant. He had seen it before. He had, in a sense, lived inside the end of one of the largest empires in human history, and he had watched it retreat and shrink and hand back its power, piece by piece. And now here was a dead man in a dead city, describing the exact same feeling 1,000 years earlier, in an empire that had been just as certain of its own permanence, right up until the moment it was gone. So Glubb did something that no professional historian had quite done in the same way before him. He decided to count. He took the great powers of recorded history, the ones everybody agrees were dominant, the ones that ran the known world for a while, and then stopped, and he lined them up, and he measured how long each one lasted from its rise to its fall. Assyria, Persia, the empire of Alexander and the Greeks who came after him. The Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, the Arab conquests that produced the Baghdad of that complaining scribe, the Mamelukes of Egypt, the Ottomans, Imperial Spain, the Russia of the Romanovs. And his own, Britain, 11 of them. And when he laid the numbers side by side, something came back at him out of the table that he had not gone looking for and could not explain away. They were all about the same length. Not exactly. Nothing in history is exact. But they clustered tightly around a single number, and the number was 250 years. About 10 generations of human beings, parent to child to grandchild, 10 times over, and then the thing was finished. Assyria lasted 247 years. The Arab Empire, 246. The Mameluke state in Egypt, 267. Rome as a republic, 233. Rome as an empire, a little over 200. Over and over, across 3,000 years, across completely different continents and religions and technologies and races of people who had never heard of each other, the same rough span kept coming back. 2.5 centuries. And then the lights went out. And here is the part that made a retired soldier's private hobby into something that, half a century later, is quietly rattling around inside the heads of millions of people who have never even heard his name. The United States of America declared its independence in the year 1776. Add 250 years to that. You land on the year 2026. This year, the year you are living in right now. I want to be very careful with you, because this is exactly the kind of thing that gets turned into garbage. There is a version of this story that is pure doom-scrolling narcotic, a version built to make you feel a cheap shiver and share a screenshot, and that version is intellectually worthless, and I am not going to give it to you. Because the moment you actually pick up Glubb's numbers and start pressing on them, they begin to do something very strange, and the strangeness is not the strangeness the internet thinks it is. The internet thinks the strange part is that the pattern is real. The genuinely strange part, the part that took me an unreasonable amount of time to sit with, is what happens to the pattern when you attack it. Because it does not simply fall apart. It falls apart in one place and holds together somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere that has nothing to do with the arithmetic at all. And the place where it holds is the place that should actually disturb you. So the question I want to put in front of you, and keep in front of you for the next couple of hours, is not the cheap one. The cheap one is, will America collapse in 2026? That question is beneath you, and it is beneath the evidence. The real question is harder, and it does not have a comfortable answer. The real question is this. Is there actually a clock? Is there a real, countable, mechanical lifespan buried inside the history of every great power? Something as regular as a heartbeat. Something that was ticking under Assyria, and under Rome, and under the British Empire, and is ticking under you, right now, as you sit there. Or did a heartbroken old man, who had just watched his own life's work taken away from him, stare into the fog of history, and see a face that was never really there, and then, through sheer force of a good story, teach the entire modern internet to see the same face in the same fog? Those are the only two possibilities. Either the clock is real, or a very persuasive man taught 100 million people to hallucinate it. And I genuinely could not tell you when I started which of those two answers was going to turn out to be scarier. I can tell you now that I was wrong about which one it would be, but we have to earn that. So let me tell you about the man who built the clock, because you cannot understand what the clock is until you understand what had just happened to the man who first heard it ticking. John Bagot Glubb was born in the spring of 1897, which means he was born near the absolute high noon of the British Empire, into a world where roughly a quarter of the land on the planet and a quarter of the people on it answered, in some fashion, to London. His father was a Royal Engineers officer, so the boy grew up inside the machinery of that empire, moving where the army moved. He went to war as a very young man, into the trenches of the First World War, and the war marked him in a way that is almost too on the nose for the story he would later tell. A shell fragment tore away part of his lower jaw. He carried the wound for the rest of his life, and later, when he was living among the Bedouin of the Arab world, they gave him a name for it. They called him Abu Hunayk. It means, roughly, father of the little jaw. Think about that image for a moment, because we are going to come back to it. A man whose face was permanently reshaped by the violence of a dying imperial order, who then spent the rest of his life trying to understand why imperial orders die. Because that is what he did next. After the war, Glubb went east, and he did not come back for the better part of 40 years. He went to Iraq, and then to what was then called Transjordan, and he fell in love, completely and permanently, with the Arab world, its language, its history, its people, its deserts. He learnt to speak Arabic fluently. He read the old Arab historians in their own tongue, and in 1939 he was given command of a small, strange, brilliant military force called the Arab Legion, the Army of Jordan. For 17 years he built it and led it. He led it in the War of 1948. He became one of the most famous Englishmen in the entire Middle East. A figure out of an adventure novel, the British officer who had gone native and commanded an Arab army. The newspapers called him Glubb Pasha. Pasha, the old Ottoman title of high honour. He was, for a while, something close to a legend. And then, on the 1st of March in 1956, on a single ordinary morning, it ended. The young king of Jordan, Hussein, who was barely out of his teens, dismissed him, fired him, told the most famous British soldier in the Arab world that he had until the following day to leave the country he had served for decades. It was politics, of course. Jordan was under enormous pressure to stop looking like a British puppet, to put Arab commanders in charge of the Arab Legion, to cut the visible strings that ran back to London. Glubb was the most visible string of all. So he had to go. He was given a few hours to pack up a life. And he flew home to an England that was, in that exact same season, sliding into the Suez Crisis, the single most humiliating episode in the long retreat of the British Empire. The moment the whole world got to watch London discover that it was no longer strong enough to get its way. I am not telling you this because it is interesting background. I am telling you this because you cannot separate it from the theory. This is a man who was, personally, physically, expelled from the empire's frontier at the precise historical instant that the empire itself was being publicly humiliated and shown to be finished. He did not read about imperial decline in a book. He was carried out of it, on a plane, with a few hours' notice, at the age of 58, his life's work handed to other men. And when he got home, knighted, honoured, and utterly finished with the only career he had ever wanted, he sat down and over the next 20 years wrote something like 17 books trying to make sense of the thing that had happened to him. And near the end of all of it, when he was almost 80 years old, he wrote a short essay, barely more than a pamphlet, and he called it The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival. And that pamphlet is the thing that will not die. That pamphlet is the reason you are here. Here is what I need you to hold on to as we go down into this. The first thread. The one I am going to keep pulling on until the very end. Glubb did not think the most important thing he had found was the number. Everyone who shares his work online thinks the number is the point, the 250, the clock, the countdown. Glubb thought the number was almost a distraction. He thought the important thing was something underneath the number, something he could feel but could barely name. Some invisible substance that holds a people together and lets them do impossible things, and then curdles, and stops holding, and lets them fall apart. He watched it hold Britain together through 2 world wars. He watched it dissolve. And he was convinced, right up until his death in 1986, that this dissolving thing, this vanishing glue, was the real engine of the whole cycle, and that the 250-year clock was just the shadow it cast on the wall. Keep that in the back of your mind. The glue. We are going to spend 2 hours getting to the bottom of what it is, and by the time we do, I think you are going to recognise the feeling of it leaving. Because I think, if you are honest, you can already feel it leaving. That is the part I could not shake. That is the part that is worse than any date on any calendar. But before we can get anywhere near that, we have to do the thing the internet never does. We have to actually look at the clock. We have to take the 11 empires and the 6 stages and the whole beautiful, terrifying machine Glubb built, and we have to see how it is supposed to work. Because it is genuinely, structurally beautiful. And then, once you have felt how well it fits, once you are leaning in and nodding along and feeling that cold thrill of a pattern clicking into place, I am going to do to it exactly what a serious person is obligated to do. I am going to try to break it. And you are going to watch it break. And then you are going to watch what is left standing after it breaks, which is the only part that ever mattered. So here is the machine. Glubb's claim is not just that empires last about 250 years. Any fool can notice that big things end. His claim is far more specific and far more unsettling than that. His claim is that they all die the same death, in the same order, passing through the same 6 stages in the same sequence every single time, like a disease with a fixed clinical progression. And once you learn to see the 6 stages, you cannot unsee them, and that is exactly the problem, and we will get to why that is a problem later. For now, just watch them come. It begins with what he called the Age of Pioneers, or sometimes the Age of the Outburst. A poor, hard, tough, aggressive people come out of nowhere. They are usually from the edges, the margins, the borderlands, the places nobody was watching. They have nothing to lose and enormous energy and a kind of reckless courage, and their answer to every problem is action, rather than deliberation or committee. They improvise, they adapt, they take impossible risks, and because the established powers around them have grown slow and comfortable and rule-bound, these newcomers smash through them. Glubb's line about them is that they are poor, hardy, enterprising, and above all aggressive. They do not have sophisticated weapons or grand institutions yet. They have hunger and nerve. And it is almost always enough. Then, as the conquests pile up, the pioneers turn into something more organised. This is the age of conquests proper. They stop improvising and start systematising. They adopt the good weapons and the good administrative tricks of the older civilizations they are overrunning. The wild raiders become a disciplined professional machine. The empire acquires its borders, its roads, its bureaucracy, its shape. This is the phase we build the statues for. This is the phase of the great generals and the famous victories, the phase every empire remembers as its golden youth. And it is real. The strength is real. That is what makes what comes next so hard to see while it is happening. Because the conquests produce wealth, and the wealth produces the 3rd stage, the Age of Commerce. The huge new territory, unified under one government and one set of laws, is fantastic for trade. Merchants move freely across distances that used to be lethal. Cities swell. Money pours in from every direction, and in the first half of this stage, the old virtues are still intact. The men who built the trading empire are still hard, still serious, still carrying the discipline they inherited from the Age of Conquest. They are just applying it to commerce instead of war. This is the peak. This is the moment an empire is richest and strongest and most admired all at once. the moment it looks utterly permanent, the moment nobody, and I mean nobody, believes it could ever end. Rome at this stage owned the Mediterranean. Baghdad at this stage was the most sophisticated city on earth. Britain at this stage was painting a quarter of the map its own colour. And this is the exact moment the rot starts, invisibly, at the root, precisely because everything on the surface looks so good. Because gradually, Glubb says, and this is the hinge of the entire theory, gradually the desire to make money begins to eat the society from the inside. Wealth stops being a means and becomes the point. And this is the fourth stage, the age of affluence, and Glubb is absolutely merciless about it. He wrote that there does not appear to be any doubt that money is the agent which causes the decline of a strong, brave, and self-confident people. Money, not invasion, not plague, not bad emperors, money. Because when a society gets rich enough, the thing that motivated the pioneers, honour, duty, service, glory, the willingness to die for something bigger than yourself, quietly gets replaced by a single new motive. Cash, the brilliant young people who, in the age of conquest, would have gone to the frontier and risked their lives for the flag, now go where the money is. The goal of the ambitious is no longer to serve the empire. The goal is to get rich, get comfortable, and get out of the way of anything dangerous. The soldier is replaced by the businessman as the model of a successful life, and Glubb, remember, was a soldier who had just been discarded by an empire cutting its costs. He felt this one personally. Then comes the stage that I think is the strangest and the most modern of all of them, and the one almost nobody talks about: the age of intellect. Because a rich society does something predictable with its money, it builds schools, universities multiply, learning explodes. Glubb notes that in this phase almost every city acquires its university, and enormous energy pours into knowledge, debate, argument, criticism, analysis, and this sounds like a good thing. This sounds like the glorious flowering of a civilization. But Glubb saw something dark in it, and here is where he says one of the lines that genuinely stopped me. He says that in the age of intellect, amid a babble of talk, the ship drifts onto the rocks. The endless talking, the endless clever argument, the endless splitting of hairs and taking of positions and demolishing of other people's positions, it does not produce action. It produces paralysis. The society becomes magnificent at analysing its own problems and completely incapable of doing anything about them. Everyone is brilliant. Everyone has a take. Everyone can explain, in devastating detail, exactly why everyone else is wrong. And nothing gets done, and the ship drifts, and the rocks get closer, and the cleverest people on board are busy writing essays about the geology of the rocks. And then, at the end, the age of decadence. The disease reaches its final stage, and this is where Glubb gets specific in a way that is genuinely uncomfortable, because his list of the symptoms of decadence does not read like ancient history. He said, decadence shows up as a set of markers that appear together again and again in the last chapter of every empire he studied. An overwhelming pessimism, a sense that the best days are behind, a loss of faith in the future, a turn toward frivolity, distraction, entertainment, the eternal impulse to eat, drink and be merry because tomorrow we die, a collapse of the old shared religion or shared belief, whatever it was that used to bind the society into one body with one purpose. And the celebrities. This is the one people quote most, and for good reason. Glubb wrote that the heroes of a declining nation are always the same. The athlete, the singer, the actor. He wrote that the word celebrity had come to mean a comedian or a football player, rather than a statesman, a general, or a great writer. He wrote that in his own time, football in Britain and baseball in the United States had become the activities that chiefly interested the public. A society at the peak of its power builds monuments to soldiers and founders. A society at the end of its life builds monuments to entertainers. And a man reading this in the 21st century, surrounded by a civilization that has turned the private lives of the famous into its dominant art form, does not exactly feel reassured. Now, before I take this any further, I have to stop and kill something, because if I do not kill it now, it will poison everything that comes after. There is a quote that has fused itself to this entire subject like a barnacle, and you have almost certainly seen it, and there is an excellent chance you believe it is ancient wisdom, and it is not. The quote goes, "Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times." You have seen it over a photograph of a Roman statue. You have seen it attributed to some ancient philosopher, or to Ibn Khaldun, or very often to Glubb himself. It is none of them. It is not ancient. It is not from the 14th century. It is not even from the 20th. That sentence was written in the year 2016 by an American author named G. Michael Hopf, and it appears in a self-published post-apocalyptic survival novel called Those Who Remain. It is a line of modern genre fiction, and the fact that it has been laundered into sounding like 3,000 years of accumulated human wisdom, the fact that millions of people repeat it as if it were carved into the foundations of civilization, is itself, if you think about it, a small perfect example of the exact thing Glubb was describing. A society that can no longer tell the difference between deep historical knowledge and a catchy line from a paperback. I am killing it now, so that when you see it in the wild, and you will, you know exactly what it is. It is not evidence, it is a t-shirt. But the reason that fake quotes spread so easily is that it rhymes with something in Glubb that is real, and the real version is more interesting than the fake one. Because Glubb genuinely did believe the cycle was self-inflicted. He genuinely did believe that success carries the seed of its own destruction. That the very things that make an empire strong, the wealth, the security, the education, the comfort, are the things that eventually rot it. The strength creates the affluence, and the affluence dissolves the strength. That part is real. Hopf just compressed it into a slogan and stripped out everything that made it defensible. And the slogan travelled 1,000 times farther than the argument ever could. Which again is the pattern. The shallow version always outruns the deep one. Remember that, because it is going to matter enormously when we get to the man who actually deserves the credit for all of this. 600 years before Glubb was born. Now watch what the 6 stages do when you put them in a line, because this is the part that produces the cold feeling. Pioneers, conquest, commerce, affluence, intellect, decadence. Read them again slowly. Every single stage is the direct product of the one before it. The pioneers win the conquests. The conquests generate the commerce. The commerce generates the affluence. The affluence funds the intellect. And the intellect, the wealth, and the comfort together produce the decadence. It is not a list of unrelated misfortunes that happen to befall empires. It is a chain of causes, each one detonating the next, and the horrifying implication is that there is no exit. You cannot skip a stage. You cannot enjoy the wealth of the age of commerce and refuse the affluence that follows it. You cannot build the universities of the age of intellect and refuse the paralysis they bring. According to Glubb, the seeds of stage 6 are planted in the soil of stage 1, and the whole thing runs to completion the way a struck match burns to the end, and the brighter it burns at the peak, the more certainly it is consuming the fuel that will leave it dark. And that, right there, is why this pamphlet by a retired soldier will not die. Because it does not feel like a theory of history. It feels like a diagnosis. It feels like being handed an X-ray of your own civilization with a shadow on it that the technician will not quite meet your eyes about. Assyria ran the sequence and died at 247. The Arabs ran the sequence and died at 246. The Mamelukes ran it and died at 267. And Glubb pointed out, with a kind of grim delight, that the Mameluke state is almost unique in history because it began on one clearly datable day, a military mutiny in the year 1250, and ended on another clearly datable day, its defeat by the Ottomans in 1517, so there is no fudging the arithmetic, no wiggle room, just a hard start and a hard stop, and 267 years in between. And America started its clock unmistakably on the 4th of July, 1776. And here we are. I want you to feel how short 10 generations actually is, because the number 250 sounds like deep time, like something safely far away, and it is not. 10 generations is the distance from you to a single ancestor you could almost have met. Picture your own family, your parents, then their parents, your grandparents, then theirs. You can probably name your great-grandparents, or at least hold a photograph of them. That is 4 generations, and it reaches back 100 years, to people whose faces you might have on a wall. Now go back only that far again, and again, one more short hop, and you are at 10. 10 grandparents deep is the whole lifespan of an empire. The entire arc of Rome from its rise to the end of its republic, the entire arc of the Arab conquests from the desert to the puppet caliphs, the entire arc of the British Empire from its first ships to its last retreat, each of them fits inside the space of one family's photograph album, if the album were long enough. That is what Glubb was really saying when he said 10 generations. He was saying that the whole life of the largest thing human beings have ever built, the thing that feels eternal from the inside, the thing you cannot imagine ending, is only about as long as the line of grandmothers standing behind you, and you are, right now, standing at the far end of one of those lines. So you are leaning in now. Good. You should be. The fit is real, and I am not going to insult you by pretending it is not. But this is the exact moment, the moment you are most convinced that a serious person has to turn around and attack the thing they just built. Because everything I have told you so far is the case for the prosecution. It is the version that makes you share the screenshot. And if I stopped here, I would be doing the cheap thing, the doom scroll thing, the thing I promised you I would not do. So now we do the hard thing. Now I show you where the clock breaks. And it breaks badly. It breaks in a way that should, by rights, end the entire discussion and send Glubb's pamphlet into the bin where serious historians have always insisted it belongs. Watch. Start with the biggest one. The empire that should have been on Glubb's list and was not. The empire whose absence is so glaring that once you notice it, you cannot understand how the whole theory survives the noticing. The Eastern Roman Empire. What we usually call Byzantium. When the western half of Rome fell apart in the 5th century after Christ, the eastern half, ruled from Constantinople, did not fall. It kept going. It kept calling itself Roman because it was Roman, in an unbroken line of legitimacy and administration and law, and it lasted from the conventional split of the empire around the year 395 until the Ottomans finally battered down the walls of Constantinople in 1453. For very close to 1,000 years, not 250, 1,000. 4 times Glubb's magic number. A single continuous imperial state that ran for a millennium, straddling the supposed clockwork lifespan again and again and again without dying. And it is not alone. Look at the Ottoman Empire, the one that finally killed Byzantium. Glubb puts the Ottomans on his list with a lifespan of 250 years, from 1320 to 1570. Beautiful, right on the number. Except the Ottoman Empire did not end in 1570. In 1570, the Ottomans were nowhere near finished. They would go on conquering for another century. They took the island of Crete in the 1660s. They besieged Vienna and nearly took it in 1683. The Ottoman Empire, by any normal reckoning, lasted from around the year 1300 until it was formally dissolved in 1922 after the First World War. That is more than 600 years. So how did Glubb turn 600 years into 250? He simply chose to end the count in 1570, around the peak, and to treat everything after that as some kind of afterlife that does not count. And notice what that means. For the Ottomans, he ends the clock at the peak of power. But for Russia, for the Romanovs, he runs the clock all the way to the actual fall of the dynasty in 1916. He uses one rule for one empire and a completely different rule for another, and the rule he uses, in each case, is precisely the rule that produces a number close to 250. This is the thing that once you see it, you cannot stop seeing. Glubb had the answer before he had the evidence. He knew the number was going to be around 250, and then he went looking for start dates and end dates that would give him that number. And history is so vast and so full of plausible beginnings and plausible endings that if you are allowed to choose which coronation, which battle, which mutiny, which treaty counts as the real birth and the real death of an empire, you can make almost any empire come out to almost any length you like. Watch him do it with Rome. Rome is a problem for a 250-year theory, because Rome in some form dominated the Mediterranean for the better part of 1,000 years. So what does Glubb do? He cuts Rome in half. He calls the Republic one empire, running about 233 years, and the empire a completely separate one, running about 200 years. As if the Rome of Julius Caesar and the Rome of Augustus were two unrelated civilizations rather than the same continuous city passing through a change of management. Split one long thing into two shorter things, and suddenly you have two data points that both land near your target instead of one embarrassing data point that blows the target apart. And here is the part that should really make you sit back. Glubb knew. He was not hiding it. If you actually read the pamphlet, instead of the screenshot of the pamphlet, you find that he says it himself, in plain language. He writes that the dates given are largely arbitrary. Those are close to his exact words. He admits that empires do not usually begin or end on any certain date. He tells you, right there in the text, that he is not really trying to prove anything, that he is exploring, that the numbers are soft. The man who is quoted everywhere as having discovered the iron law of the 250-year imperial lifespan told his own readers, in writing, that the dates underneath that law were more or less chosen, and essentially none of the millions of people passing his number around have read far enough to find that sentence. They took the table and threw away the paragraph that admits the table is a rough sketch, which means the single most viral idea in modern amateur history, the countdown clock ticking under America right now, rests on a foundation that its own author openly described as arbitrary. If that does not bother you, you are not paying attention. If it does bother you, hold that feeling, because we are not done, and the theory is about to get a second life from a direction you will not expect. Because you might be thinking, alright, this is settled. The man was a talented amateur who fooled himself and then fooled the internet. The professionals must have laughed him out of the room. Let us move on. And they did laugh. But they laughed at him from inside a glass house so enormous that the laughter is its own scandal, because Glubb did not invent the idea of cyclical, predictable, rise and fall history. He was the tail end of a long and once wildly respectable tradition, and watching what happened to the rest of that tradition tells you something important about why nobody in a serious history department will touch any of this with a barge pole today. The two giants before him were named Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee. Spengler was a German schoolteacher who, in the shadow of the First World War, published a vast, dark, thunderous book called The Decline of the West, in which he argued that every civilization is a kind of living organism with a fixed lifespan of roughly 1,000 years, passing through a spring, a summer, an autumn, and a winter, as inevitable as the seasons, and that the West was deep into its winter. The book was a sensation. It sold enormously. It shaped how a whole generation of frightened Europeans understood the catastrophe they had just lived through. And then came Toynbee, a British historian who spent decades of his life and 12 entire volumes constructing an even grander system, a study of history, surveying more than 20 civilizations and claiming to extract from them the universal laws by which civilizations rise, break down, and disintegrate. For a while in the middle of the 20th century, Toynbee was one of the most famous intellectuals alive. He was on the cover of Time magazine. His system was supposed to be the key to all of history. And then the professional historians got hold of it, and what they did to it was not a disagreement. It was an execution. The most famous blow was struck by a British historian named Hugh Trevor Roper, who loathed Toynbee's system with a passion that is genuinely startling to read. He called it a gigantic muddle, a work of pseudo-religion, and, in a phrase that has outlived almost everything Toynbee wrote, he described the whole enterprise as a kind of prophetic mush, dressed up as scholarship. A Dutch historian named Peter Gale spent years publicly demolishing it, calling Toynbee's method a travesty of the scientific method, and saying the great system was really a kind of metaphysical speculation wearing the costume of history. The charge over and over from the serious people was always the same, that these grand thinkers started with a pattern they wanted to find, and then went shopping through the enormous supermarket of world history, picking out the facts that fit the pattern and quietly leaving on the shelf the mountains of facts that did not. That they were not doing history. They were doing pattern matching. They were reading tea leaves and calling it science. And underneath all of it sat the deepest objection, the philosophical one, made most forcefully by Karl Popper in a book called The Poverty of Historicism. Popper's argument is the one you have to reckon with if you want to take any of this seriously, so let me put it as sharply as I can. Popper said that this entire genre, the search for grand laws of historical destiny that let you predict the future course of nations, is not a science at all. It is prophecy. And the reason it is prophecy and not science is that it can never be proven wrong. If America does not collapse in 2026, the believer simply says the collapse is delayed, or the empire is in a lingering decadence, or the real end date was somewhere else. The theory absorbs every possible outcome. Nothing could ever happen that would make its believers say, well, I suppose the theory was false, and a claim that is compatible with every possible future, Popper said, tells you exactly nothing about the actual future. It only feels like knowledge. It has the shape of knowledge and the emotional weight of knowledge, and none of the substance. It is a beautifully carved key that does not fit any lock. So here is the abdication, and it is a real one, and it cuts both ways. On the one hand, the historians are right. Glubb's arithmetic is indefensible. His dates are cherry-picked. His greatest counterexamples are simply left off the board, and he admitted the softness himself. The whole cyclical tradition he belongs to was weighed by the most serious people in the field, and found to be. As rigorous predictive science, worthless. That is not my opinion. That is the settled verdict of the historical profession, and on the narrow question of the clock, of the number, of the countdown, the profession is correct, and you should believe them. But here is the other edge of it, the part that started to genuinely unsettle me the longer I sat with it. Go and look for the serious academic paper that takes Glubb's 250-year claim and carefully, rigorously refutes it. Go and look for the definitive scholarly demolition of the fate of empires specifically. You will have trouble finding it. Not because it is unrefutable, but because it is beneath them. The professionals did not refute Glubb, they ignored him. He was a soldier, an amateur, a man writing pamphlets in his retirement, and the Guild of Professional History simply declined to notice he existed. And into that silence, into that vacuum where a serious engagement should have been, the internet poured. The professionals were so certain the question was unserious that they never bothered to publicly answer it. And so the only voices left talking about it, for decades, were the believers. The experts abandoned the field, and when the experts abandon a field, they do not get to be surprised about who moves in. But none of that, none of it, the cherry-picked dates, the missing Byzantium, the arbitrary admission, the philosophical impossibility of the whole genre, none of it touches the thing that actually keeps me up. Because the historians, in their completely justified fury at the bad arithmetic, threw out something along with it, and I do not think they noticed what they were throwing out. They were right that there is no clock. They were right that the number is a fiction, and the dates are a con, and the whole idea of a predictable 250-year lifespan is a face in the clouds. But underneath the fake clock, Glubb was pointing at a real thing. Not a schedule, a mechanism. A specific, describable process by which prosperous societies dissolve from the inside. And that mechanism does not depend on any number at all, and it keeps showing up, in culture after culture, with a consistency that the arithmetic never had. The clock is fake, the disease might be real, and to see why I am willing to say something that strong, I have to take you back 600 years before Glubb was born, to a besieged fortress in the North African desert, and introduce you to the man who actually discovered all of this, the man Glubb spent his entire life standing next to and never once named. His name was Ibn Khaldun. He was born in Tunis in the year 1332, into a world that was, by any measure, falling apart around him. He lived through the Black Death, which killed both his parents when he was a teenager, and erased something like a third of everyone he had ever known. He lived in North Africa and Islamic Spain during a period of relentless political chaos, dynasties rising and collapsing, viziers murdered, cities changing hands, one short-lived ruler after another. He served many of those rulers himself, as a scholar, an administrator, a diplomat, and he was imprisoned by some of them, and he watched from the inside, at the highest levels of power, the machinery by which states are born, and then rot, and then die. He was not a soldier like Glubb. He was something closer to a spy, and a judge, and a political operator who had seen too much. And in the year 1375, exhausted by all of it, he withdrew to a remote fortress in what is now Algeria, and over the next few years he wrote an introduction to a planned history of the world. And that introduction, which he called the Muqaddimah, is one of the most astonishing things any human being has ever produced. Because in it, 600 years before Glubb, 500 years before Spengler, Ibn Khaldun laid out, with a rigour and a psychological depth that neither of them ever matched, essentially the entire theory of the rise and fall of civilizations. He said that dynasties have a natural lifespan, like individual human beings. He said that lifespan generally runs about 3 or 4 generations before the thing collapses and is replaced. He described how a tough, cohesive people from the harsh margins, the desert, the mountains, the borderlands, conquer the soft, wealthy cities. He described how, once they have won, the wealth and comfort of city life begins to erode the very toughness that let them win in the first place. He described how the third and fourth generations, born into luxury, having never known the hardship that forged their grandfathers, lose the capacity to hold the thing together, until a new hungry group comes out of the margins and does to them exactly what they once did to someone else. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is Glubb's 6 stages. It is the pioneers and the affluence and the decadence. It is all of it, already there, fully formed, in the 14th century. But Ibn Khaldun had a word for the thing at the centre of it, and this is the word I have been circling since the very beginning. This is the glue. He called it Asabiyyah. It is usually translated as group feeling, or social solidarity, or group cohesion, but none of those quite capture it. Asabiyyah is the invisible force that makes a group of people willing to sacrifice for one another. It is the thing that makes a man die for the men beside him. It is the felt sense that we are one people, that your fate is my fate, that the group is real and worth suffering for. Ibn Khaldun said that Asabiyyah is forged in hardship, in the brutal conditions of the margins where you genuinely cannot survive alone, where cooperation is not a virtue but a survival requirement, and where, as a result, the bonds between people are welded shut. That is the fuel. That is what the pioneers really have that the soft cities have lost. Not better weapons. Stronger Asabiyyah. A fiercer, deeper willingness to stand together and die for each other. And here is the tragedy that Ibn Khaldun saw with total clarity. The tragedy that is the black heart of this whole subject. Asabiyyah is destroyed by its own success. The group cohesion wins the empire. The empire produces wealth and security and comfort. And wealth and security and comfort are precisely the conditions under which Asabiyyah dissolves, because when you no longer need each other to survive, the welds begin to melt. The grandchildren of the conquerors, safe and rich and individually comfortable, no longer feel that fierce oneness, because nothing in their soft lives ever demanded it of them. They become individuals pursuing individual pleasures in a society that used to be a body and is now just a crowd. And a crowd, however wealthy, cannot defend itself against a group that still has its Asabiyyah intact. The solidarity that built the empire cannot survive the empire it built. That is the mechanism. That is the real engine under Glubb's fake clock. It is not a number. It is the slow death of the willingness of strangers to sacrifice for one another, and it runs on a logic so brutal and so self-defeating that once you understand it, you start seeing it everywhere, which again is going to turn out to be the problem. Now, Glubb spent 36 years of his life in the Arab world. He spoke and read Arabic fluently. He read the classical Arab historians in the original. He wrote something like 17 books on Arab and Islamic history. Ibn Khaldun is not some obscure figure you have to dig for. Ibn Khaldun is, without much argument, the single most important and most famous historian the medieval Islamic world ever produced. A titan. A man whose Muqaddimah is one of the foundational texts of the entire civilization. Glubb devoted his life to studying. There is essentially no way, none, that John Bagot Glubb did not know exactly who Ibn Khaldun was, and exactly what he had written. And yet, when Glubb sat down to write The Fate of Empires, he opened it by claiming that this whole way of seeing history, this cyclical, patterned, rise and fall conception, appeared never to have entered the minds of historians before him. He presents the core idea as if he were the first to think it. He does not name Ibn Khaldun, not once. The man who got there 600 years earlier, the intellectual giant of the very culture Glubb loved and lived inside for 4 decades, is simply absent, erased, unmentioned, as though he had never existed at all. I want to be fair here, because fairness is the only thing that separates this from the doomscroll garbage. I cannot prove what was in Glubb's head. It is possible, barely, that he genuinely thought his framework was original, that in his old age he had absorbed Ibn Khaldun so completely that he no longer knew where the older man's ideas ended and his own began, which is its own kind of quiet erasure, but not a deliberate one. What I can tell you is that the modern scholars who study both men treat them as saying fundamentally the same thing, and that the older man said it first, said it deeper, and said it with a psychological subtlety that the soldier never reached. And I can tell you that there is a bitter irony sitting on top of all of this that I cannot quite let go of. The single most quoted line in this entire genre, the hard times create strong men line, the one I already told you was written by a novelist in 2016, is constantly wrongly attributed to Ibn Khaldun. So we have arrived at a perfect little monument to how this subject actually works. A real thinker, Ibn Khaldun, who genuinely discovered the theory, gets his actual ideas taken and repackaged by a soldier who does not credit him. And then, centuries later, a fake quote from a paperback gets stapled onto that same real thinker's name, so that he is simultaneously robbed of the ideas he did have and saddled with words he never wrote. That is the information ecosystem we are all swimming in. That is what it looks like when a civilization can no longer tell the deep thing from the shallow thing. But set the credit dispute aside, because it is not really the point. And let me show you why the existence of Ibn Khaldun changes the entire meaning of what we are doing here. If Glubb were the only person who had ever noticed this pattern, you could dismiss the whole thing as one clever old man's coincidence hunting. One observer, one pattern, easy to wave away as a fluke or a projection. But Ibn Khaldun did not read Glubb, obviously, and Glubb, whatever he admitted, clearly drank from the same well Ibn Khaldun dug. And they are not the only two. This same essential idea, that societies are held together by a cohesive force forged in hardship, that the force decays under prosperity, and that the decay follows a describable arc, keeps being independently rediscovered across the entire span of human thought. You find versions of it in the ancient Greek historian Polybius describing the cycle of Roman government. You find it echoed by moralists in that 10th century Baghdad we started with. You find it in Spengler and Toynbee. You find it, dressed in modern clothes, in serious quantitative social science being done right now, today, which we are going to get to, and which is the part that should frighten you most of all. When the same pattern is seen independently by a 14th century Tunisian judge, an ancient Greek hostage in Rome, and a 21st century scientist with a supercomputer, you are looking at one of two things. You are either looking at a real feature of how human societies actually work, or you are looking at a bias so deep and so universal in the human mind that every intelligent person who stares at history for long enough hallucinates the exact same ghost. And I genuinely cannot rule out the second one. That is what I need you to understand. The universality of the pattern is not proof the pattern is real, because there is a rival explanation that is just as consistent with the evidence, and the rival explanation is about you, not about history. Human beings are pattern-finding machines. We evolved to see faces in shadows and intentions in weather and stories in random noise, because the cost of seeing a pattern that is not there was always lower than the cost of missing a pattern that was. We are the descendants of the nervous ones who saw the tiger that was not there and lived, not the calm ones who missed the tiger that was. So when we look at the vast, chaotic, essentially random sprawl of human history, we cannot not see patterns in it. We are constitutionally incapable of looking at 3,000 years of rise and fall and seeing no shape. And decline in particular is a shape we are almost desperate to see, because every generation that has ever lived has felt in its bones, that things were better before and are getting worse, that the young have gone soft, that the old virtues are dying. That feeling is not historical analysis. That feeling is just what it feels like to get older inside any society at all. And here is the second foreshadow, the thing I am planting now and coming back to at the end, so mark it. It is entirely possible that the deepest, truest thing about this whole 250-year cycle is not that it describes empires. It is that it describes the human need to believe empires are dying. And if that is true, then a civilization that becomes obsessed with its own decline, a civilization that produces endless essays and videos and pamphlets about the fall that is surely coming, is not necessarily a civilization that is actually falling. It might just be a civilization that has gotten rich enough, and idle enough, and frightened enough to spend all its time staring into the fog looking for the face. Which is a symptom Glubb had a name for. He called it the Age of Intellect. And you and I are sitting inside it right now, having this exact conversation. Hold that, because we are about to meet the one man who tried to drag this entire subject out of the fog and into the daylight of actual falsifiable science. The one man who did the thing Glubb only dreamed of doing, and what he found is either the strongest evidence the disease is real, or the most elaborate and disciplined version of the same ancient hallucination. And unlike everyone before him, he made a specific, dated, checkable prediction. And then we got to watch what happened. His name is Peter Turchin, and his story starts, improbably, with beetles. Turchin was born in the Soviet Union in 1957, the son of a dissident, and his family was eventually expelled and ended up in the United States. He trained as a population biologist, and he spent the first stretch of his career doing hard, quantitative, mathematical ecology, studying why the populations of animals, beetles and mice and voles rise and crash and rise again in cycles. He was very good at it. He built mathematical models that could take the messy, noisy fluctuations of a living population and find the underlying equations, the feedback loops, the predator and prey dynamics that drove the booms and the busts. And then, sometime around the turn of the millennium, he did something that almost no scientist ever dares to do. He looked up from the beetles and asked whether the same mathematical tools, the same search for cycles and feedback loops and underlying equations, could be turned on the most complex population of all: human societies. He asked whether history itself might have dynamics you could actually measure. Most of his colleagues thought this was, to put it politely, little short of madness. History is not a laboratory, you cannot run it twice. It is the domain of contingency, of the individual, of the accident, the assassinated archduke, the lost battle, the great man in the right place. The idea that you could reduce it to equations, that you could find laws in it the way you find laws in the motion of the planets or the population of voles, cut against everything the humanities had believed for a century. But Turchin was not really a historian, and did not much care about the taboos of the field. He gave his new science a name. He called it Cliodynamics, from Clio, the ancient Greek muse of history, and dynamics, the study of things that change over time. And unlike Glubb, unlike Toynbee, unlike every grand theorist before him, Turchin did the one thing that separates a science from a prophecy. He built his models, he fed them the historical data, and then he used them to make a specific quantitative, falsifiable prediction about the future, and he published it in advance with a date on it, where everyone could see it and where it could be proven wrong. The prediction appeared in the year 2010 in the pages of Nature, which is one of the 2 or 3 most prestigious scientific journals on the planet. It was a short piece, and its central claim was blunt. Turchin wrote that the next decade, the 2010s leading into the early 2020s, was likely to be a period of growing political instability in the United States and in Western Europe. He was not reading tea leaves, he was reading variables. And this is where it stops being Glubb and becomes something much harder to dismiss. Because Turchin's model does not run on vibes about decadence and celebrity culture, it runs on measurable quantities, and the central one has a name that has since escaped the academy and started showing up everywhere, and the name is elite overproduction. Let me explain it, because it is the sharpest idea in this entire field, and once you have it, you cannot stop seeing it either. Every society produces elites, the people who hold the positions of power and wealth and status, the seats at the top. And the number of those seats is relatively fixed. There are only so many spots. Now, in a healthy society, the number of people who are trained and credentialed and hungry to occupy those elite seats stays roughly in balance with the number of seats available. But under certain economic conditions, and especially when the wealth of a society is flowing upward, concentrating at the top, you start producing far more aspiring elites than there are elite positions to hold them. You get too many people with law degrees and advanced credentials and enormous ambitions and expectations of status, all competing for a number of real elite slots that has not grown to match. And these surplus elites, these frustrated, credentialed, ambitious people who were promised a seat at the top and cannot find one, do not just quietly accept their disappointment. They become the fuel for political conflict. They turn on the system that failed to place them. They become radicals, agitators, factional leaders, the organizing intelligence of instability. Turchin's grim insight is that revolutions and civil wars are very rarely led by the poor. They are led by frustrated elites, by the overproduced, by the people who had every expectation of power and were denied it. And underneath elite overproduction sits a second measurable force that Turchin calls popular immiseration, which is the technical way of saying that the living standards and the real wages of ordinary people have stagnated or declined even as the overall wealth of the society has grown. The pie gets bigger, but the slice going to the average person gets smaller, because more and more of the growth is being pumped upward. Turchin literally calls this mechanism the wealth pump, a structural arrangement that siphons the gains of a society away from the broad population and toward the top. And when you have those two things running at the same time, a wealth pump immiserating the general population and simultaneously overproducing a swollen, frustrated elite class fighting over a fixed number of seats, you get the classic preconditions for what Turchin calls an age of discord. He mapped these forces across American history and found a striking rhythm, waves of political violence and instability peaking roughly every 50 years. The 1870s, in the bloody aftermath of the Civil War, the 1920s, the era of labour wars and bombings and unrest, and then his model pointed at the next peak, the early 2020s. And what makes this so much harder to dismiss than Glubb's vibes about celebrity culture is that you can watch the American version of it in ordinary concrete life once Turchin has taught you the shape. Think about the wealth pump first. Across the long stretch from roughly the end of the Second World War into the 1970s, the wages of ordinary American workers rose more or less in step with the productivity of the economy. When the country produced more, the typical worker took home more, and then, somewhere in the 1970s, those two lines, productivity and the typical wage, quietly came apart. And they have stayed apart ever since. The economy kept getting more productive, the output per worker kept climbing, but the income of the median worker, adjusted for the actual cost of living, largely stalled decade after decade, while the gains that used to be shared flowed upward and pooled at the top. That is not a metaphor. That is the wealth pump, visible in the raw economic data of half a century. Now put the second mechanism next to it. In that same half century, the country produced an enormous surplus of highly credentialed, highly ambitious people, far more holders of advanced degrees and professional qualifications than there were elite positions to absorb them. The number of people graduating with law degrees, to take Turchin's favourite example, has swollen far beyond the number of prestigious legal careers that can possibly exist, producing a generation of trained, indebted, ambitious people who were promised a place near the top and discovered on arrival that the chairs were already full. Multiply that across every prestige profession and you get exactly the condition Turchin warned about: a growing mass of frustrated, capable, credentialed people with elite expectations and no elite seat, which is, historically, the single most combustible material a society can produce. This is not an ancient soldier squinting at football crowds. This is measured wage data and measured credential data, and it points, cold and quantitative, at precisely the instability the model predicted. He published that in 2010. Sit with the timing of it. A decade before it happened, in the world's leading scientific journal, a former beetle biologist ran his equations and wrote down that the United States was heading into a period of sharply rising political instability that would crest in the early 2020s. And then, the early 2020s arrived, and whatever your politics, whatever you think caused it, you lived through what happened next. You do not need me to narrate it to you. You watched a level of political conflict, institutional distrust and civil unrest that a great many people found genuinely frightening, arriving almost exactly on the schedule that a scientist had published in advance with the arithmetic attached 10 years earlier. Turchin and a colleague went back in 2020 and formally assessed the prediction against what had actually happened, and the assessment, published in a peer-reviewed journal, was that the forecast had substantially held up. Now, I have to slow down here and be as honest with you as I have tried to be about Glubb, because the temptation right now is to swing too far the other way, to say, there it is, the clock is real after all, a scientist proved it. No, that is not what happened, and I will not let you walk away believing it. Turchin's work is real science in a way Glubb's never was, because it is falsifiable, because the variables are measured rather than felt, because the prediction was public and dated and checkable. But falsifiable does not mean proven, it means testable, and a test that comes out right once is evidence, not proof. There are serious critics who argue that Turchin's 50-year cycles are still, at bottom, a small number of data points with a lot of interpretive freedom in how you count them, uncomfortably close to the same freedom that let Glubb make everything come out to 250. Predicting a decade of instability is a broad target, and instability is a broad word. And a critic can fairly ask whether the prediction would have looked wrong under almost any plausible 2020s at all. These are real objections, and I am not going to pretend they have been settled, because they have not. But here is why Turchin should disturb you more than Glubb ever could, and it is not because he is right. It is because he might be, and you cannot wave him away. Glubb you could dismiss with a shrug the moment you saw the cherry-picked dates. He gave you an easy exit. His arithmetic was so obviously soft that a skeptic could feel clever and move on. Turchin gives you no exit. He took the ancient, disreputable tea-leaf reading intuition that Ibn Khaldun and Glubb were both chasing. The intuition that societies decay according to a describable internal logic, and he did the thing you are supposed to do with an intuition to find out if it is true. He made it precise, he made it measurable, he made it predict, and then the prediction did not embarrass him. And that means the question you cannot escape is no longer, was that old soldier fooling himself? The question is now, what if the thing the old soldier was clumsily pointing at, with his fake numbers and his arbitrary dates, is actually there? What if the disease is real, and Glubb just took its temperature with a broken thermometer? And there is one more thing about Turchin that I cannot leave out, because it closes a loop I opened at the very beginning, and it is almost too perfect. Remember that when Glubb finished The Fate of Empires, in his old age discarded by the empire he had served, he wrote a small, wistful, almost defeated wish. He wrote that if he were a rich man, he would want to fund a department at some university dedicated entirely to the scientific study of the rhythm of the rise and fall of nations. He did not have the money or the tools or the training to build such a thing himself. He was a soldier at the end of his life, gesturing at a science that did not yet exist. And then, decades later, on the other side of the world, a Soviet-born beetle biologist went and built almost exactly the thing Glubb had wished for. Turchin founded a whole quantitative discipline, complete with databases of hundreds of past societies, dedicated to precisely the question Glubb could only dream about. The old man asked for a science of the fall of nations. And the science came. It just came too late for him to see it, and it came speaking a language. The language of equations and data and falsifiable prediction that the old soldier would barely have recognized as an answer to his own question. I have to be careful though, because next to the real science there is a great deal of expensive-looking junk, and you deserve to know the difference. If you go looking into this subject, you will very quickly run into a wildly popular theory called the fourth turning, developed by two writers, William Strauss and Neil Howe, who argue that history moves in cycles of roughly 80 to 100 years, divided into 4 generational seasons, and that the United States has been building toward a great crisis, a fourth turning, arriving right about now. It has been enormously influential. It has, by some accounts, shaped the thinking of people at the highest levels of American power, and it is, by the assessment of nearly everyone qualified to judge it, much closer to Glubb than to Turchin, closer to astrology than to science. The generational categories are loose enough to fit almost anything, the predictions are vague enough to always seem confirmed, and the whole apparatus has the same fatal quality Popper warned us about, the quality of never being able to be wrong. So when you wade into these waters, and the current is strong, you have to keep asking the one question that separates the science from the seduction. Not, does this fit? Everything fits. The question is, what would it look like if this were false, and could I tell the difference? Glubb fails that question. The fourth turning fails that question. Turchin, alone, at least tried to pass it. Hold on to that distinction like a railing, because we are about to walk out over the part of this where the fog is thickest, the part where we stop talking about dead empires and start talking about the one you are living in. So let us do the thing that the screenshot version does badly and dishonestly, and let us do it carefully. Let us take Glubb's actual checklist of decadence, the specific markers he said appear together in the final chapter of every empire, and let us hold each one up against the United States in the year 2026, one at a time, and let us be scrupulously fair about where it fits and where it does not, because the honest picture is stranger and more disturbing than the propaganda in either direction. And I am going to start with the one that fits so cleanly it is almost unpleasant, and then I am going to show you the one that shatters the whole thing, because you need both to understand what you are actually looking at. Start with pessimism, because it is the cleanest fit and the numbers are not soft. Glubb said, a defining marker of a society entering decadence is a pervasive loss of faith in its own institutions and its own future, a collective sense that the machine is broken and the best days are behind. So go and look at the measured trust that Americans have in their own federal government, which the Pew Research Center and the National Election Studies have been tracking since the late 1950s. In the year 1958, when they first asked, about 73% of Americans said they trusted the government in Washington to do the right thing most of the time, or just about always. 73%. nearly 3 out of 4. That was a society that, whatever its enormous flaws and injustices, broadly believed in its own institutions. Now come forward to today. By 2024 and into 2025, that number had collapsed to somewhere around 17%. Not 70. 17. Fewer than 1 in 5 Americans now say they trust their own federal government to do the right thing with any regularity. That is not a dip. That is one of the steepest and most sustained collapses of institutional faith ever measured in a major nation. A fall from 3/4 of the population to under 1/5 across a single human lifetime. Glubb predicted exactly this feeling, and here it is, quantified, undeniable, sitting in 70 years of survey data. Now take the collapse of shared belief, which Glubb, and Ibn Khaldun before him, considered central. The dissolving of the common faith that once bound the society into a single body. In the United States, the most direct measure of this is the rise of what researchers call the nones, the people who, asked their religion, answer none. In the year 2007, about 16% of American adults were religiously unaffiliated. By the early 2020s, that figure had climbed to around 28 or 29%, which is now the single largest group in the country, larger than Catholics, larger than any single Protestant tradition. In the span of about 15 years, the religiously unaffiliated went from a small minority to the largest bloc in American religious life. On its face, this is Glubb's marker arriving precisely on schedule, the old shared faith draining out of the civilization. But here, right here, is where honesty forces me to do the thing the doom merchants never do, which is to tell you the part that complicates my own argument. Because the most recent data, from 2023, 2024, and into 2025, suggests that the rise of the nones has slowed, and may have levelled off, and by some measures even ticked slightly the other way. The decline that looked like a smooth slide into secular oblivion appears to have hit something like a plateau, and it is not even clear that it means what Glubb would have wanted it to mean, because when you look closer, a large majority of Americans, including a majority of the unaffiliated themselves, still report believing in God or some higher power. Still report believing that human beings have a soul. The shared institutional religion weakened enormously. The underlying hunger for meaning did not vanish, it scattered. And a marker that was supposed to be a straight line toward the abyss turned out to have a kink in it that Glubb's model has no way to explain. That kink matters. Remember it, because it is the first hard piece of evidence that the machine does not actually run on rails. Now the celebrity marker, the famous one, the one everybody quotes. Glubb wrote that the heroes of a declining nation are the athletes and the singers and the actors, that the very word celebrity comes to mean an entertainer rather than a statesman or a soldier or a great thinker. And I almost do not need to make this argument to you, because you are living inside the proof of it. We have built an entire economy, an entire information system, an entire structure of aspiration around fame itself, around influence as a career, around the private lives of people whose primary achievement is being watched. The most followed human beings on the planet are entertainers and athletes, and people famous for being famous. A child today, asked what they want to be, is now statistically quite likely to answer that they want to be a person who is watched, a creator, an influencer, a star. Glubb, writing in 1976 about football and baseball, was describing the faintest early sketch of what has since become the total condition of the culture. On this one, the fit is so complete it barely needs stating. And yet, I have to put the knife into my own argument again, because a serious person has to, and because the weakness here is instructive. The trouble with the celebrity marker is that it may prove nothing at all. Every society in every era has adored its entertainers and its athletes. The Romans packed the Colosseum. That 10th century Baghdad we opened with was already complaining about its pop singers 1,000 years ago. The crowds cheered the gladiators and the charioteers with exactly the frenzy we bring to our own stars. So if the worship of entertainers is present at the peak of an empire, and at the birth of an empire, and at the death of an empire, if it is simply always there, then it cannot be a specific symptom of the end. It is just a permanent feature of human beings living together in large numbers. Glubb saw a real thing. The enormous scale and centrality of modern celebrity, but he may have mistaken a constant for a warning light. This is the danger of the whole enterprise in miniature. When you are looking for decline, everything starts to look like decline, including the things that were always there. Then take the marker Glubb was almost gleeful about, the welfare state, because he said something genuinely provocative about it that is worth sitting with even if it makes you angry. Glubb wrote that we tend to imagine the welfare state as a kind of pinnacle of human moral achievement, the point at which a society finally becomes rich and decent enough to care for all of its people, and he said, "No, look at the history. The expansion of the welfare state is not the high point of a civilization, it is one of the regular recurring milestones of an empire that has grown old and is entering its decline." He had noticed that dying empires, from Rome to the Arab world, tended to expand their public distributions, their bread and their subsidies, and their support of the population. In the very same late phase where the cohesion was dissolving. And whatever you think of the politics of that, the raw fiscal shape of the modern United States does fit it with uncomfortable precision. The largest and fastest growing part of the American federal budget by far is now what is called mandatory spending, the entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare and the rest, which in the 2020s passed $4 trillion a year and now consume roughly half of all federal spending, a share that has climbed steadily for decades and is projected to keep climbing. The pattern Glubb pointed at, an aging empire devoting an ever larger share of its resources to sustaining its population rather than expanding its strength, is visible in the actual numbers. And underneath it sits the marker he considered the true root of all of them, materialism, the replacement of every older motive, honour and duty and faith and service, with the single motive of money, the conviction that the purpose of a life is to acquire and consume. That one I cannot hand you a clean statistic for, because you cannot put a number on a civilization's soul. And I am not going to pretend I can. But I will say that a society whose most watched, most rewarded, most aspired to lives are overwhelmingly organised around the acquisition and display of wealth is at least living inside the condition Glubb described, even if the condition refuses to be measured. Take that one as softer than the others, because it is. Honesty requires grading your evidence, not just collecting it. Now watch the whole clean story break, because this is the marker that does not just fail to fit, it points in the opposite direction, and an honest person has to say so loudly. Glubb argued that a decadent empire becomes defensive and turns away from strength. That, in his phrase, money being in better supply than courage. A declining power starts paying off its enemies with subsidies instead of confronting them with weapons, and hides behind walls, from the Great Wall of China to Hadrian's Wall to the Maginot Line. It grows militarily timid. It shrinks from the world. Now look at the actual United States. In the year 2024, American military spending reached nearly $1 trillion, close to $997 billion in a single year, which is more than the next several countries on Earth combined, roughly 3 times what China spends, and something like a third of all the military spending of the entire human species concentrated in one nation. Whatever that is, it is not the timid, wall-hiding, tribute-paying defensiveness of Glubb's decadent empire. It is the opposite. It is armament on a scale the world has never seen. So on one of his own central markers, one of the ones he cared about most, the United States does not just fail to fit the pattern, it inverts it. And you have to hold that failure with exactly the same seriousness you held the trust collapse. Or you are not thinking, you are just believing. And then there is the marker I have been dreading, the one I have to handle with more care than any of the others, because it is the ugliest thing in Glubb's model and the place where his framework curdles into something you should refuse to swallow whole. Glubb listed as a symptom of decadence an influx of foreigners into the capital, a change in the composition of the population of the imperial heartland. He pointed at the great cities of dying empires filling up with peoples from the margins and the conquered territories. And I want to be exact about what is wrong here, because it matters. Glubb himself, to his limited credit, insisted repeatedly that he did not consider these newcomers inferior, that they were, in his words, not inferior, merely different. But the framing itself, the very act of listing human beings arriving in a city as a symptom of civilizational disease, the same way you would list pessimism or frivolity, is a framing you should hold at arm's length and examine hard, because it treats the presence of people as a pathology, and that is a move with a very dark history. And here is what should make you most skeptical of Glubb on precisely this point. His own model contradicts him. His entire theory begins with the claim that empires are founded by vigorous outsiders coming in from the margins, that the influx of hungry newcomers is the engine of the pioneer stage, the source of the strength. So the arrival of outsiders is the birth of an empire when Glubb wants it to be, and the death of an empire when he wants it to be, and he never resolves the contradiction, because it cannot be resolved, because it was never really an analysis. It was an old man's anxiety about a changing country dressed in the costume of a historical law. That is the moment, more than any other, where you should feel the whole edifice wobble and remember that its author was a man with the prejudices of his time and place, and that a pattern which can absorb the exact same fact, the arrival of foreigners, as both the cause of greatness and the cause of ruin, is not a pattern at all. It is a mirror, showing the observer his own fears. But now, having broken it, having shown you the inverted marker and the contradictory one and the plateau that should not exist, I have to turn around one last time. Because there is one marker left, and it is the one that does not break, and it is the one Ibn Khaldun cared about more than any other, and it is the reason I cannot simply file all of this under superstition and walk away. The loss of social cohesion, the dissolving of the glue, not celebrity, not religion in the narrow sense, not the composition of cities, but the deeper thing underneath all of those, the willingness of strangers to regard each other as one people. And unlike the celebrity marker, this one is measurable, and unlike the military marker, it does not invert, and unlike the religion marker, it has not plateaued. It has gotten worse, steadily, measurably, for decades. A political scientist named Robert Putnam documented the beginning of it in a famous study called Bowling Alone, showing that across the second half of the 20th century Americans systematically withdrew from the shared associational life, the clubs, the leagues, the unions, the civic groups, the churches, the 1,000 small institutions in which strangers used to become a community. And it did not stop. In 2023, the Surgeon General of the United States issued a formal public health advisory declaring an epidemic of loneliness and isolation, reporting that around half of American adults had been experiencing measurable loneliness. Half, and on top of the loneliness, the hardening of Americans against each other along political lines, what researchers call affective polarization, has been climbing relentlessly. By the early 2020s, large majorities of committed partisans on each side had come to see the people on the other side not merely as wrong, but as immoral, as a threat, as something closer to an enemy population than a set of fellow citizens with different opinions. The share of Americans who regard their political opponents as actively dangerous to the nation has risen to levels that alarm the people who measure it for a living. That is the glue. That is Asabiyyah, measured in modern instruments. And it is the one marker in Glubb's entire catalogue that survives every objection I have thrown at the rest of them. It is not a constant that was always there like celebrity worship. Putnam showed it moving. It does not invert like the military spending. It has not plateaued like the religious decline. It is a real, measured, decades-long dissolving of exactly the invisible substance that Ibn Khaldun said was the true life of a civilization, the thing that makes strangers willing to sacrifice for one another, and it is happening right now in the country whose 250th birthday falls in this very year. And here, finally, is the third time I am going to point at the thing waiting for us at the bottom of all this, so that when we reach it, you will feel that you already knew. The disturbing conclusion of this entire investigation is not going to be about a date. The clock is fake, we established that. Byzantium alone killed the clock 1,000 years ago. The disturbing conclusion is that underneath the fake clock there really is a wasting disease, and it has exactly one symptom that matters, and that symptom is the quiet dissolving of the willingness of a people to be one people. And you do not need a survey to check for it. You can feel it. You have been feeling it. And in a moment, I am going to tell you why the fact that you can feel it, the fact that we are all so aware of it, the fact that you clicked on this at all, might be the most ominous data point of them all. But I have been making you take my word for it that this disease, this dissolving of the glue, is a real process that actually kills real empires, and you should not take my word for it, you should watch it happen. So let me take you back one more time to where we started, to that scribe in Baghdad complaining about the pop singers, and let me show you what came for his world, because the death of the Arab Empire is one of the clearest case studies of the mechanism there is, and almost nobody tells it as what it actually was, which is a slow internal dissolving, followed by a death blow that only looked like the cause. When that scribe was writing, around the year 930, the Abbasid Caliphate ruled from Baghdad over the richest, most learned civilization on earth. Its scholars were translating and preserving the entire inheritance of Greek philosophy that Europe had lost. Its mathematicians were inventing the algebra you learned in school. Its capital was a city of perhaps 1 million people at a time, when the largest cities of Christian Europe were muddy towns of a few thousand. And it was, by every marker Glubb ever named, already deep into its decadence. The old Arab warriors who had exploded out of the desert 3 centuries earlier, carried by a ferocious shared faith and a shared purpose that let a handful of tribes conquer from Spain to the borders of India in a single lifetime, those men and their descendants had long since settled into the comfortable, sophisticated, individualistic life of a wealthy imperial capital. And here is the specific, concrete symptom of the dissolving glue, the one you can actually point at. The caliphs no longer trusted their own people to fight for them. The shared willingness to serve, the thing that had built the empire, had drained away so completely that the rulers of the Arab Empire stopped raising armies from the Arab population at all. Instead, they bought slaves. They imported foreign soldiers, Turkish warriors from the steppes of Central Asia, men with no stake in the society and no bond to its people, called the Ghilman, and they built their armies out of them, because the wealthy, comfortable population of the imperial heartland was no longer willing to do its own fighting. Think about what that actually means, because it is the death of Asabiyyah made visible. A society that will not defend itself, that has to import strangers to hold the weapons, has already lost the invisible thing, and it curdled exactly the way you would expect. Within a generation or two, those foreign slave soldiers, the ones the caliphs had brought in to replace their own unwilling people, realized that they, and not the caliph, held the actual power because they held the swords, and they began making and unmaking caliphs at will. The commander of the faithful, the supposed successor to the prophet and ruler of the Islamic world, became a puppet, a figurehead kept alive or murdered at the pleasure of his own foreign guard. One caliph was blinded and left to die, the empire fragmented, province after province breaking away under local strongmen, until the caliph in Baghdad ruled little more than the city itself, a hollow crown on a hollow state, still magnificent, still learned, still producing poetry and mathematics, and completely unable to defend a single mile of its own frontier. And then, in the year 1258, the Mongols arrived, and what happened next is what the doom merchants would point to as the cause of death, the great external catastrophe, the barbarian at the gate. The armies of Hulagu Khan besieged Baghdad, broke it in less than 2 weeks, and then destroyed it with a thoroughness that still aches to read about. They sacked the House of Wisdom, the greatest library in the world, and threw so many books into the Tigris that the river was said to have run black with ink and then red with blood. They killed the population in numbers we still cannot reliably count, hundreds of thousands at the least. They executed the last caliph, and because Mongol custom forbade spilling royal blood on the ground. The story goes that they rolled him in a carpet and had their horses trample him to death. The 500-year-old Abbasid Caliphate ended in that carpet. And it is very easy, and very wrong, to look at that and say, there it is, the Mongols destroyed the Arab Empire. The Mongols did not destroy the Arab Empire. The Mongols destroyed a corpse. The empire had died from the inside a century or more before Hulagu was born, when it lost the ability to raise an army from its own willing people and had to buy foreign strangers to hold its swords. The glue was already gone. The Mongols simply walked through a door that the dissolving of Asabiyyah had already unlocked from the inside, and they wrote the cause of death on a certificate for a patient who had been dying, quietly without fever, for generations. That is the mechanism. That is what it looks like in the actual historical record, with actual names and actual dates. Not a clock running out. A slow internal wasting, invisible on the surface, right up until the moment some external shock that a healthy society would have absorbed proves suddenly mysteriously fatal. And if you think that is a peculiarity of the medieval Islamic world, watch the same exact thing happen to Rome, because it is the same story told in Latin. Early Rome, the Rome that conquered the Mediterranean, fought its wars with citizen soldiers, ordinary Roman farmers who left their fields to serve because they believed, with a fierce and genuine conviction, that Rome was theirs and worth dying for. That belief was the Roman Asabiyyah, and it was so strong that Rome could lose entire armies, could lose 50,000 men in a single afternoon at Cannae against Hannibal, and simply raise another army and keep fighting, because the willingness to serve was effectively bottomless. No ancient state could break a people like that. But by the late Empire, that willingness had drained away exactly as it drained from Baghdad. The wealthy would not serve. The comfortable bought their way out. And Rome, like the Abbasids, began filling its legions with foreign barbarians, Germanic tribesmen with no love for Rome, until the army that supposedly defended Rome was largely composed of the very peoples it was defending against. And when the end came, when Rome was sacked, it was often sacked by men who were already inside the system, already in Roman uniforms, already, technically, Roman soldiers. The barbarian at the gate was frequently a barbarian who had been let in and handed a sword a generation earlier because no Roman would carry it. Same disease, same symptom. Same death written on the certificate of a patient who had been dying of something, with no name. I am telling you these two stories back to back, Baghdad and Rome, 500 years and half a world apart, because the parallel is the whole argument, and it is an argument that survives everything I did to Glubb's arithmetic. The dates are different, the numbers are different, the clock is fake, but the mechanism, the specific, concrete, documentable mechanism, a society growing too comfortable to defend itself, outsourcing its cohesion to strangers, and then dying from an external blow that a younger version of itself would have shrugged off. That mechanism is not fake, and it is not a face in the fog, because you can trace it in the actual records, name by name, and it is the same in two civilizations that never met. And now you understand why I could not simply throw Glubb in the bin with the fake clock and walk away, and why I have to take you all the way to the bottom of this. But before I take you to the bottom, I owe you the strangest thing I found, and it is the thing that finally changed my mind about which answer was the frightening one. Because I have now put 3 men in front of you who spent their lives staring at the rise and fall of nations. A 14th century Tunisian judge who lived through the Black Death, a 20th century British soldier expelled from his own empire's frontier, a 21st century Soviet-born scientist with a database of hundreds of societies. And here is what should stop you. They do not agree on the number. They do not agree at all. Ibn Khaldun said a dynasty lasts 3 or 4 generations, something like 120 years. Glubb said 250, 10 generations, more than twice as long. Turchin does not really work in single imperial lifespans at all. He works in overlapping waves, 50-year cycles of violence, riding on top of longer secular trends of a century or two. 3 serious observers, 3 completely incompatible clocks. And if you were looking for proof that the whole thing is a hallucination, there it is. Right there. If there were a real mechanical 250-year clock, they would have found the same number. They did not. The numbers are all different. The numbers are noise. And yet, and this is the thing I cannot get past, the move that Glubb's critics never made because they stopped reading at the numbers. Underneath the 3 incompatible clocks, the 3 men are describing the same disease. Every one of them, from his own century, in his own language, using his own broken instruments, arrived at the identical mechanism. Not the identical timetable, the identical mechanism. All 3 of them say that the thing which kills a great society is not, at bottom, an external enemy. It is internal. It is the decay of cohesion, the dissolving of the solidarity that lets a mass of individuals act as a single body. Ibn Khaldun called it the loss of Asabiyyah. Glubb called it the death of the shared belief and the triumph of selfishness over service. Turchin measures it as elite fracture and popular immiseration, and the collapse of the norms that hold a polity together. 3 different vocabularies. 1 disease. They disagree about how long the patient has. They agree completely about what the patient dies of. And what the patient dies of is never the barbarian at the gate. This is the part that took me a long time to absorb, and that I think is genuinely important. So let me say it as plainly as I can. In almost every case these men studied, the external shock that finally ends an empire, the invasion, the conquest, the collapse, is not really the cause of death. It is the moment of death. Which is a different thing. The barbarian at the gate does not bring the disease. The barbarian at the gate simply walks through a door that the disease had already unlocked from the inside. Rome did not fall because the tribes beyond the frontier suddenly got stronger. Rome fell because Rome had already hollowed out, had already lost the internal cohesion, the shared willingness to sacrifice. that had once let it absorb defeats that would have destroyed a weaker society 10 times over. Early Rome lost battles constantly and did not fall, because the glue held and the society could take the blow and close ranks and come back. Late Rome lost the glue, and then the same kind of blow that it had shrugged off for centuries was suddenly fatal. The enemy did not change. The body changed. The disease is always internal. The invader is just the cause of death written on a certificate for a patient who is already dying of something, with no name and no fever and no visible symptom except a slow, quiet unwillingness of people to be one people. Now I can tell you why I changed my mind about which answer was scarier, the real clock or the shared hallucination, because I realized the question was wrong. I had been treating it as a fork. Either there is a mechanical clock ticking under civilizations, which would be frightening, or there is no clock and we are all just pattern hallucinating primates seeing faces in the fog, which would be a relief. But that second option, the one I had filed under relief, is not a relief at all once you follow it all the way down. Because suppose it is true. Suppose there is no clock, no 250-year law, no mechanical destiny, and the truth is simply that human beings are pattern-finding animals who cannot look at history without seeing decline, and who are especially prone to seeing it when they are wealthy and idle and frightened. Suppose that is the real answer. Then look at what we are doing. Look at what this is. Look at the explosion, in our specific moment, of exactly this material. The endless essays and books and videos and pamphlets about the coming fall, the obsession with the 250-year clock, the memes about hard times and strong men, the entire booming cultural industry of decline. If the pattern is not real and the obsession with the pattern is just a symptom of a certain kind of anxious, comfortable late-stage society, then our obsession with it is the data. The very fact that you are watching this. The very fact that this exists to be watched. The fact that a video essay about the fall of empires can find an enormous, hungry audience of people who feel, in their bones, that something is ending that is not analysis of the symptom. That is the symptom. Glubb had a name for this, and it is the cruelest joke in the whole story. He called it the Age of Intellect. He said that one of the surest signs a civilization has entered its decline is that it becomes magnificent at talking about itself, that the universities multiply and the analysis deepens and everyone becomes an expert on the society's problems, and that all of this brilliant, endless, self-aware talking coincides precisely with the society's growing inability to actually do anything. Amid a babble of talk, he said, the ship drifts onto the rocks. And what is this? What are we doing right now, you and I, at this exact moment? We are talking, with enormous sophistication, drawing on 14th century philosophy and 21st century data science, about the precise mechanism of our own possible decline. We are the babble of talk. We are the ship's passengers writing brilliant essays about the geology of the rocks. The self-awareness that feels like it should be our protection. The fact that unlike Rome we can see it coming, that we have the data and the history and the theory, might be nothing more than the most advanced possible expression of the disease itself. A civilization so far into its age of intellect that it has produced a genre of entertainment about its own death. And that is the trap that has no flaw, because now you cannot even use your own awareness as a comfort. You cannot say, well, at least we can see it, at least we are not blind like the empires before us, because the seeing is itself the thing the theory predicts you would be doing at this stage. Every escape route folds back into the maze. If the clock is real, you are on it. If the clock is fake, your obsession with the clock is the symptom. There is no position you can take, no thought you can think about this, that lands you safely outside the pattern. Even the thought I am having right now, the thought that there is no safe position, is exactly the kind of thought a mind produces in the age of intellect. I told you at the start that I could not tell you which answer would turn out to be scarier. This is why. It is because both answers, followed honestly to the end, deliver you to the same place, and the place has no exit. I promised you a long time ago now that we would come back to two things, and I want to keep both promises before we go down the last stretch because they close the circle. The first is that man in Baghdad, the 10th century scribe complaining about the pop singers and the shorter working week, and the women in the professions and the endless obsession with luxury and fame. Remember why Glubb quoted him? Glubb quoted him because reading that 1,000-year-old complaint felt exactly like reading a modern newspaper. And I want you to notice something about that feeling now that we have been all the way down. That feeling of recognition, that shiver of this is us, this is happening again, is genuinely ambiguous, and its ambiguity is the whole story. Either it is the shock of recognizing a real recurring disease across 1,000 years, which is terrifying, or it is the shock of recognizing that human beings in every era, including 1,000 years ago, have always felt exactly this way, have always believed their own age was uniquely decadent and uniquely doomed, which means the feeling proves nothing, and we are simply the latest in an unbroken chain of people who mistook the ordinary anxiety of being alive in a society for the special symptom of a dying one. The Baghdad scribe felt what you feel, and his civilization did, eventually, fall, but not for centuries after he wrote, and not in any way he could have predicted, and the feeling he had was the same feeling that people had in societies that went on to thrive for hundreds of years more. The feeling is real. What the feeling means is the thing nobody can tell you. And the second promise, that jaw. At the very beginning I told you about the shell fragment in the First World War that tore away part of young John Glubb's face, and the name the Bedouin gave him for it, Abu Hunaik, father of the little jaw, and I told you we would come back to it. Here is why it matters. Because everything Glubb ever wrote about the death of civilizations was written by a man who had been physically broken by the violence of an empire, and then had given his whole life to another people's cause, and then had been discarded by that cause in a single morning, expelled at nearly 60, with a few hours to pack. His theory is not really a theory. It is a wound. It is one man's attempt to make cosmic, universal, law-governed sense out of the specific, personal, unbearable fact that the thing he loved and served had ended and thrown him away. And I think that is the final key to why this pamphlet will not die. Why it keeps finding new millions of readers. Why it found you. It is not because the arithmetic is good. The arithmetic is terrible. It is because Glubb was writing from inside the exact feeling that his readers are living inside. The feeling that something vast that you belong to is quietly coming apart, and that you can see it, and that you are powerless to stop it, and that no one in charge seems willing to say so out loud. He was not describing the fall of empires. He was describing that feeling. And the feeling, it turns out, is the most durable thing in this entire story. More durable than any empire, more durable than the truth. There is one thing left that we have not looked at, and it is hiding in plain sight, in the title itself. Glubb did not call his essay The Fate of Empires and leave it there. He called it The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival. Search for Survival. The title makes a promise. It promises that after the diagnosis, after the 6 stages and the 11 corpses, and the merciless account of the disease, there will be a second half, a way out, a treatment, an answer to the only question that actually matters to a person living inside a late-stage society, which is not, how do empires die, but rather is there anything at all, that we can do? And I went looking for that answer, because if Glubb had found it, it would be the most important thing in the pamphlet by an enormous margin. And what I found is the quietest, saddest failure in the whole document, and also I think the most honest thing in it, because Glubb did not find a cure. He looked, and he could not find one, and to his credit, he mostly does not pretend otherwise. What he offers, in the end, is barely more than a gesture. He suggests that the only thing that has ever renewed a civilization is a return to the things that built it, a revival of duty, of service, of self-sacrifice, of the willingness to put the group above the self, some recovery of the shared belief and the shared purpose that the affluence and the intellect had dissolved, which sounds, when you first read it, like an answer, and then you realize it is not an answer at all. It is just a restatement of the problem with the sign flipped. It is like telling a dying man that the cure for his illness is to not be ill. Of course a society survives if it recovers its cohesion, its Asabiyyah, its willingness to sacrifice for one another. That is precisely what dissolving means, by definition. Saying the cure is to reverse the dissolving is not a treatment. It is a tautology dressed as hope. And it gets worse when you put Glubb's non-answer next to Ibn Khaldun's actual mechanism, because Ibn Khaldun already explained 600 years earlier why Glubb's gesture cannot work. Asabiyyah, remember, is not something a society can decide to have. It is not a policy. It is not a choice. Ibn Khaldun was brutally specific about where it comes from. It is forged in hardship. It is welded together in the harsh conditions of the margins, in the places where people genuinely cannot survive alone, where cooperation is not a moral ideal, but a physical necessity, where the bonds between people are hammered into permanence by shared suffering and shared danger. That is the only forge that has ever produced the real thing. And that means the cure for a dying civilization, the recovery of its cohesion, requires the precise conditions that a wealthy, comfortable, secure civilization has spent all of its wealth and comfort and security specifically to escape. You cannot manufacture Asabiyyah in a society that has succeeded, because the success is what dissolved it, and no society that has known comfort will voluntarily choose the hardship that would forge it again. The cure exists. It is simply not available by choice. It only arrives after the fall, delivered to the hungry newcomers on the margins who will use it to build the next empire, which will dissolve it in exactly the same way forever. That is what Ibn Khaldun understood that Glubb could only gesture at. The search for survival was doomed before it began, because the one thing that produces survival is the one thing prosperity cannot buy and cannot fake and will never willingly endure. So we are left, you and I, exactly where the honesty of this whole investigation has been driving us the entire time, with every comforting exit sealed off one by one. We cannot trust the clock, because the clock is fake, because Byzantium ran for 1,000 years and the Ottomans for 600, and Glubb chose his dates to hit a number he already had in his head, and admitted as much in a sentence almost none of his readers ever reach. That much is settled, and you should hold it against anyone who tries to sell you the countdown. But we cannot dismiss the disease either, because the disease was seen independently by a 14th century judge and a 20th century soldier and a 21st century scientist, and stripped of its fake numbers, it reduces to a single claim about the slow death of the willingness of strangers to be one people, and that single claim is the one marker that survives every test. That is climbing in every instrument we have, that you can feel moving in your own country, and possibly in your own chest. And we cannot even take refuge in our own awareness, because the awareness is the symptom, because a civilization that produces an endless stream of sophisticated meditations on its own decline is, by the theory's own logic, displaying the exact late-stage condition the meditations are about. And we cannot reach for the cure, because the cure is hardship, and hardship is the one thing no comfortable people will ever choose, and by the time it is not a choice anymore, it is not a cure, it is the fall itself. I have thought about this for a long time now, longer than is probably healthy, and I keep arriving at the same place, and the place is not a conclusion, because there is no conclusion, there is only a recognition. The recognition is this: every single person who has ever lived inside a great power, in every century, in every civilization, has felt some version of what you are feeling right now. The Baghdad scribe felt it 1,000 years ago and wrote it down, and it survived to unsettle a British general 1,000 years later. The general felt it, discarded on a plane at nearly 60, and wrote it down, and it survived to unsettle you. Somewhere in a wealthy, anxious, comfortable society 200 years from now, if there is one, someone will feel it again, and they will find our essays and our videos and our data the way Glubb found the Baghdad complaint, and they will get the same shiver, the same "this is us, this is happening again," and they will not be able to tell, any more than we can, whether the shiver is the recognition of a real recurring death, or simply the permanent sound that a certain kind of mind makes when it is comfortable enough to be afraid and idle enough to go looking for the fear. That is the vertigo I cannot climb out of, and I am not going to pretend to for your comfort, because pretending is the one thing this subject cannot survive. The United States turns 250 years old this year. The number means nothing. Glubb made it up out of dates he admitted were arbitrary, and it does not describe reality, and no serious person should believe there is a clock. And also, at the same time, in the same country, in the same year. The one thing underneath the number that was ever real, the cohesion, the glue, the shared willingness of strangers to sacrifice for one another, is measurably, undeniably, decades deep into coming apart, and no one knows how to put it back, and the only known method for putting it back is a catastrophe severe enough that it can no longer be called a method at all. The clock is a lie. The disease is real. And the most unsettling thing I learned, the thing I still do not know how to hold, is that being able to see all of this clearly, being able to name the disease and trace its history and quote the men who mapped it, does not put you outside the window looking in. It puts you deeper inside the room than anyone. The people who cannot see it are just living. You who can see it are doing the one thing the dying do that the living do not. You are standing in a comfortable, wealthy, frightened civilization, staring into the fog of your own history, looking for the shape of the end. And whether the shape is really out there in the fog, or whether it is only the reflection of your own face on the glass, is a question that has never once, in 3,000 years, been answered by anyone. It only ever gets answered by the fall, and the fall, when it comes, does not feel like a clock running out. It feels like the morning Glubb was handed a few hours to pack. It feels ordinary and personal and far too late, and it feels, right up until the very end, exactly like this.